The vast Sahara stretched endlessly in every direction, its golden dunes rippling like frozen waves under the merciless afternoon sun. The temperature had climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air shimmered with heat mirages that promised water where none existed. In this desolate landscape, where few creatures dared to venture, a heartbreaking scene was unfolding. A magnificent lioness, her once golden coat now dulled by dust and desperation, struggled across the burning sand. Her powerful frame, built for hunting on the savanna, was now gaunt and weakened. Her ribs showed through her matted fur, and her eyes, usually fierce and proud, were clouded with exhaustion and despair. But she was not alone in her suffering. Behind her, 3 tiny lion cubs, barely 3 weeks old, stumbled on unsteady legs. Their eyes had only recently opened to this harsh world, and their soft mewling cries pierced the desert silence. The smallest cub, a female with markings that mirrored her mother's, could barely lift her head. Her brothers, though slightly stronger, were fading fast under the relentless sun. The lioness, whom we'll call Zahara, meaning flower in Arabic, had no idea how she had ended up in this nightmare. The last thing she remembered was the tranquilizer dart piercing her flank as she defended her cubs from the poachers. When she awoke, she found herself and her precious babies dumped in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but sand and sky stretching to the horizon. The poachers had taken what they wanted from her pride, the males with their magnificent manes, and left her and her cubs to die. It was a cruel calculation. Lionesses with cubs were harder to sell, and the cubs themselves were too young to survive without their mother. So they had driven deep into the desert, far from any water source or shelter, and abandoned them like unwanted cargo. Zahara's maternal instincts burned stronger than the desert sun. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to protect her young, to find them safety and sustenance. She had been walking for 2 days now, her powerful paws leaving deep impressions in the sand as she searched desperately for any sign of life, any hope of salvation. The cubs' cries grew weaker with each passing hour. The smallest one, the little female, had stopped walking entirely. Zahara had to carry her in her mouth, her tiny body limp and burning with fever. The 2 male cubs followed behind, their usual playful energy replaced by an eerie quiet that terrified their mother more than any roar ever could. As the sun reached its zenith, Zahara's legs began to shake. Her mouth hung open, panting heavily, but the air was so hot it provided no relief. She looked back at her cubs, and her heart shattered. They were dying, and she was powerless to stop it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had failed them. She had failed as a mother, as a protector, as the fierce lioness she was meant to be. But even in her despair, Zahara refused to give up. She forced herself to take another step, then another. Her cubs needed her strength, not her surrender. She began to climb a particularly steep dune, hoping that from its peak she might spot something, anything, that could save them. Halfway up the dune, the smallest cub slipped from her mouth. Zahara turned back, her eyes filling with tears that evaporated before they could fall. The tiny female lay motionless in the sand, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. The 2 male cubs collapsed beside their sister, their own strength finally giving out. Zahara lay down beside them, using her body to shield them from the sun. She began to groom them with her rough tongue, a gesture of love and comfort in their darkest hour. As she licked their tiny faces, she purred softly, a sound that had once meant safety and warmth in their den. Now it was a lullaby for what might be their final moments together. The desert wind picked up, swirling sand around them like a tornado of despair. Zahara lifted her head and let out a roar, not of dominance or territory, but of pure anguish. It echoed across the empty wasteland, a mother's cry for help that seemed to vanish into the endless blue sky above. Hours passed. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the sand beneath them. Zahara's roar had faded to a whimper, and she could feel her own strength ebbing away. She had given everything she had to keep her cubs alive, and it hadn't been enough. As darkness approached, bringing with it the cold that would follow the desert's scorching heat, Zahara heard something that made her ears perk up. At first, she thought it was just another cruel trick of the desert, like the mirages that had taunted her with visions of water. But the sound grew stronger, more distinct. It was the rumble of an engine, Zahara's head shot up, her eyes scanning the horizon with renewed hope. In the distance, she could see a small convoy of vehicles, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. She recognized them as the kind used by wildlife researchers and conservationists. The same type she had seen near her original territory before the poachers came. With her last reserves of strength, Zahara stood and roared again. This time, it was different. It was a call for help, a desperate plea that carried across the desert wind. The vehicles stopped, their engines idling as the occupants tried to locate the source of the sound. Dr. Amara Hassan, a renowned wildlife veterinarian and conservationist, stepped out of the lead vehicle. She had been part of a research expedition studying the impact of climate change on desert ecosystems when they heard the lionesses roar. Her team had been tracking poaching activity in the region, and they all knew that sound was not natural for this part of the desert. "Did you hear that?" Dr. Hassan called to her team. "That's a lioness, and she's in distress." The team quickly organized a search pattern, using their vehicle lights to scan the nearby dunes. It was Dr. Hassan's assistant, a young researcher named Khalil, who spotted them first. "There," he shouted, pointing to a dune about half a mile away. "I can see something moving." As they approached, the full horror of the situation became clear. A magnificent lioness, obviously exhausted and dehydrated, was lying protectively over 3 tiny cubs. Her eyes, when they met Dr. Hassan's, were filled with a mixture of desperation and fierce maternal love that took the veterinarian's breath away. "Dear God," Dr. Hassan whispered. "How did they end up here?" The lioness, Zahara, watched warily as the humans approached. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to protect her cubs from potential threats. But she was too weak to run, and something in the woman's gentle voice and careful movements told her that these humans were different from the ones who had brought her here. Dr. Hassan moved slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring tones. She had worked with wild lions before, and she knew that a mother protecting her cubs was one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. But as she drew closer, she realized that Zahara was beyond fighting. The lioness was dying, and she knew it. "It's okay, beautiful," Dr. Hassan murmured, extending her hand slowly. "We're here to help." Zahara sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring as she tried to determine whether these strangers posed a threat. The scent was different from the poachers. Cleaner, gentler. There was no fierce sweat, no aggression, just concern and compassion. When Dr. Hassan was close enough to touch, Zahara did something that would haunt the veterinarian for the rest of her life. The lioness gently picked up one of her cubs, the smallest female who had been unconscious for hours, and placed her at Dr. Hassan's feet. Then she looked up at the woman with eyes that seemed to say, "Please, save them." Tears streamed down Dr. Hassan's face as she carefully picked up the tiny cub. The little one was barely breathing, her body temperature dangerously low despite the desert heat. "Get the medical kit," she called to her team. "We need to stabilize them immediately." One by one, Zahara allowed the humans to take her cubs. She watched with exhausted eyes as they wrapped the babies in blankets and began administering fluids through tiny IV lines. The process was familiar to her. She had seen the wildlife veterinarians working on her pride before, during healthier times. As the team worked to save her cubs, Zahara felt her own strength finally giving out. She had held on through sheer willpower, but now that help had arrived. Her body was shutting down. Dr. Hassan noticed immediately and knelt beside the lioness, her hands gently stroking the magnificent creature's head. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "All of you are going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Dr. Hassan wasn't sure she believed them. The lioness was severely dehydrated and malnourished, and the cubs were in critical condition. They needed immediate medical attention, and they were hours away from the nearest facility equipped to handle wild animals. The team worked through the night, setting up a mobile veterinary station in the desert. Dr. Hassan and her colleagues took turns monitoring the lioness and her cubs, administering fluids and medications, and providing the kind of intensive care usually reserved for hospital emergency rooms. Zahara drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever she was awake, her eyes sought out her cubs. Each time she saw them breathing, saw the gentle rise and fall of their tiny chests, she found the strength to keep fighting. Dr. Hassan marveled at the mother's resilience, at the powerful bond that kept her clinging to life for the sake of her babies. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in soft pastels, there was cautious optimism in the air. The cubs had responded well to treatment, and their vital signs were stabilizing. The smallest female, who had been closest to death, had even opened her eyes and managed to take a few drops of formula. Zahara herself was making progress, though more slowly. Years of living in the wild had made her strong, but the trauma of losing her pride and the ordeal in the desert had taken a severe toll. Dr. Hassan estimated it would be weeks, maybe months, before she was fully recovered. "We need to get them to the sanctuary," Dr. Hassan announced to her team. "They need proper facilities and around-the-clock care." The drive to the wildlife sanctuary was tense. Every bump in the road, every change in temperature, could potentially set back the fragile progress they had made. But Zahara seemed to understand that they were being taken to safety. She lay quietly in the specially designed transport cage, her eyes never leaving the smaller cage that held her cubs. The Al-Maha Wildlife Sanctuary was a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to the rescue and rehabilitation of endangered species. When Dr. Hassan called ahead to explain the situation, the entire staff mobilized to prepare for their arrival. The sanctuary's director, Dr. Omar Al-Zahra, had worked with rescued lions before, but never in such desperate circumstances. As they arrived at the sanctuary, Zahara's eyes widened at the sight of green vegetation and the sound of running water. After days in the desert, these simple things seemed like miracles. The cubs, now more alert and responsive, mewed softly at the unfamiliar sights and sounds. The sanctuary's veterinary hospital was a marvel of modern technology, with equipment that rivaled many human hospitals. Zahara and her cubs were immediately taken to separate but adjacent rooms, where teams of specialists began comprehensive examinations. The news was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The cubs, despite their ordeal, were essentially healthy. They were underweight and dehydrated, but with proper care and nutrition, they would likely make full recoveries. The smallest female, who had been so close to death, showed remarkable resilience and was already beginning to show interest in food. Zahara's condition was more complex. In addition to severe dehydration and malnutrition, she was suffering from stress-related health issues and what appeared to be grief from the loss of her mate and the other members of her pride. But Dr. Al-Zahra was cautiously optimistic. "Lions are incredibly resilient," he explained to Dr. Hassan. "Her body will recover with proper care. The emotional healing will take longer, but having her cubs alive and healthy will be the best medicine." Over the following days, the sanctuary became a hive of activity. News of the rescue had spread through the conservation community, and support poured in from around the world. Veterinary specialists flew in to consult on the case, and donations arrived to help cover the extensive medical costs. Zahara's recovery was slow but steady. She was initially suspicious of her human caregivers, but gradually began to trust them as she saw how gently they handled her cubs. The turning point came when the smallest cub, now officially named Nadia, was strong enough to nurse properly. Watching her daughter feed, Zahara's eyes filled with what could only be described as joy. The cubs, for their part, were thriving. They were curious and playful, exploring their temporary enclosure with the fearless enthusiasm of healthy young animals. They had no memory of their ordeal in the desert, but they seemed to understand that they were safe and loved. As weeks turned into months, the little family settled into a routine at the sanctuary. Zahara's strength returned, and with it, her regal bearing. She was magnificent to behold, a living symbol of the wild beauty that still existed in the world. Her cubs grew strong and confident, learning the skills they would need if they were ever to return to the wild. Dr. Hassan visited regularly, monitoring their progress and marveling at their transformation. The broken, desperate animal she had found in the desert had become a proud lioness in her healthy cubs. But she knew that their story was far from over. "What's the plan for their future?" she asked Dr. Al-Zahra during one of her visits. The sanctuary director's expression was thoughtful. "Ideally, we'd like to reintroduce them to the wild, but that's complicated. Their original territory is still controlled by poachers, and Zahara has no pride to return to. We're working with other sanctuaries and conservation groups to find a suitable habitat." The search for a new home took months. Every potential site had to be carefully evaluated for safety, prey availability, and the absence of human threats. Finally, a suitable location was identified, a vast game reserve in Botswana where other rescued lions had been successfully reintroduced. The day of departure was emotional for everyone involved. Zahara and her cubs had become beloved fixtures at the sanctuary, and saying goodbye was difficult. But everyone knew that returning to the wild was the ultimate goal. As the transport vehicle pulled away from the sanctuary, Zahara looked back one last time at the place that had saved her life. Then she turned her attention to her cubs, who were now young adults capable of surviving in the wild. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since that terrible day in the desert, she felt hope. The reintroduction was carefully managed, with the lions initially kept in large enclosures within the game reserve. Gradually, they were given more freedom to explore their new territory. Zahara's hunting skills, dulled by months of captivity, slowly returned. Her cubs learned to hunt alongside her, their natural instincts awakening in the wild environment. 6 months after their arrival at the game reserve, the family was finally released into the wild. They had established a territory near a water source, and Zahara had even been seen interacting with other lions in the area. The cubs, now fully grown, were beginning to establish their own identities within the complex social structure of the pride. Dr. Hassan received updates regularly from the game reserve's research team. The family was thriving, and Zahara had even given birth to a new cub, a sign that she had fully recovered from her trauma. The little female, Nadia, had grown into a magnificent lioness herself and was showing signs of preparing to start her own family. Years later, when Dr. Hassan would tell the story of Zahara and her cubs, she would always emphasize the same point, that in our darkest moments, when hope seems lost and despair threatens to overwhelm us, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. The decision to investigate that roar in the desert, to stop and help when it would have been easier to drive on, had saved 4 lives and given them a chance at a future. The story of Zahara became a symbol of hope in the conservation community. It reminded people that individual actions matter, that every rescue makes a difference, and that the bond between mother and child is one of the most powerful forces in nature. The lioness who had once pleaded for help in the scorching desert had become a testament to the resilience of the wild and the compassion of those who dedicate their lives to protecting it. In the vast game reserve of Botswana, where the African sun sets each evening in a blaze of orange and gold, a lioness and her grown cubs roam free. They are living proof that even in the harshest deserts, both literal and metaphorical, hope can survive. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to listen and compassionate enough to act, we can be the miracle that someone else desperately needs. The desert may be unforgiving, but the human heart, when it chooses compassion over indifference, action over apathy, can create oases of hope in the most desolate places. Zahara's story reminds us that every life has value, every creature deserves protection, and that the choice to help, even when it's difficult or inconvenient, can literally change the world. As the stars emerge over the African wilderness, and the sound of lions calling to their pride echoes across the savannah, Zahara's legacy lives on. She is no longer the desperate mother pleading for help in the desert, but a symbol of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of hope. Her cubs, now adults with cubs of their own, carry forward the gift of life that was almost lost but was saved by the kindness of strangers who refused to look away. In a world that often seems dark and hopeless, Zahara's story shines like a beacon, reminding us that miracles are possible, that lives can be saved, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stop and help. Thank you for watching this video. I would be grateful for your like. Please do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss other interesting stories. See you soon.